For 24 years, the Persian and Roman empires waged a bloody on-again, off-again war between 337 and 361 along the frontiers between the two states, fought over spheres of influence and control over the border kingdoms of Iberia and Armenia. The study of the conflict is rife with difficulties owing to inconsistencies in the source material. Aspects of the chronology are not entirely certain, but what historians do know is that this conflict prevented Constantius II from adequately dealing with a rebellion, led by his cousin Julian, which was launched when Constantius requested troops from the western provinces of the Roman Empire. And shortly after this rebellion, in 361, Constantius died. While the overall results of this conflict were indecisive, Julian's campaign, conducted between March and June of 363, ended in failure, with the emperor dead and the resulting Treaty of Nisibis leading to the ceding of a series of fortresses and cities, including Nisibis itself, a city which lay on the main route across northern Mesopotamia, and which formed one of the linchpins in Roman frontier defense. Nisibis had withstood 3 sieges during the First War, and we know about this not only from the writings of Ammianus Marcellinus, but also from 2 speeches given by the Emperor Julian. During the Third Siege, in 350, Julian described something most unusual. The Persian navy sailed over land and conducted a waterborne assault with siege towers on a city which stood at the foot of hills, arid plains, and desert. Of the 3 sieges during this war, we know almost nothing about the first 2, which occurred in 338 and 346, but we don't know when during those years. The last siege, in 350, is by comparison easier to work with, owing to 5 major pieces of evidence, the first being the speeches of Julian, and the other 4 being a series of panegyrics and hymns written by the church father Ephraim, who lived in the city during the sieges, the mid-5th century writings of Theodoret, the mid-7th century Easter Chronicle, and the 12th century account of the historian Zonaras. But these later sources pose problems because historians cannot cross-reference them with the earliest records. The relevant sections of texts like Ammianus Marcellinus' histories are simply lost. Facing usurpation in the west by the military commander Magnentius, Constantius II was thus preoccupied when Persian forces attacked. It's not clear if the Persians had been waiting for some sort of a diversion. Instead, it's likely that supplies had been stockpiled for some time, but the splitting of Roman forces and Roman attention certainly helped. The surviving sources differ on how exactly the siege of Nisibis began and how long it even lasted. 3 lengths of time were possible: 70 days, 100 days, or 4 months, and it's not certain if the Shah, Shapur II, approached the walls and demanded surrender, or if he immediately attacked. What we do know is that siege towers were sent against the walls, trenches were dug, towers were mined, and palisades were erected by the Persian forces. None of this appears to have worked, or at least the surviving sources give that impression, so the Persians decided to try another tactic. The sources differ on the exact details, but the nearby river of Mygdonius, which flowed both near the city walls and through the city itself, was diverted and dammed up. However exactly this happened is not clear, but whatever the case, it certainly was a massive construction project. The river was then released, and the ensuing torrent of water overwhelmed the fortifications and breached the walls. It's not certain how this worked, but it can be assumed that, because the sources do mention the erection of large earthworks and earthen mounds, that what probably happened was the Persians built a series of dykes around Nisibis to direct the flow of water. This would appear to make sense, given that the sources describe the flooding of the surrounding lands and the creation of a lake in the area with Nisibis at the center, and the redirected river water would have needed to be kept in place somehow. The speeches of Julian state that once the surrounding land was flooded, the Persians sent in ships with siege towers mounted on their decks to assault the walls. Tactics like this were not unknown in the ancient world. Julian had used them himself during campaigns in Gaul along rivers, and it's certainly an exciting picture. But did this actually happen? Julian does not explain how high or how thick the earthworks were in order to raise the lake to the correct level in order to make this possible, and the other sources don't make mention of Persian ships. These details also bear a striking resemblance to the fictional siege of the city of Aswan in a late antique novel called Ethiopica. So, did Julian take this tale from a novel? It is difficult to say one way or the other because its author, Heliodorus, lived sometime between 220 and 370, historians are not certain when. If the novel was written in the 3rd century, then Julian likely utilized the story. But if it was written in the late 4th century, then perhaps we can take Julian's tale of Persian ships sailing across the desert sands as at least partially true. It's certainly an exciting image to think about, but what the sources do agree on is that the river was dammed, released, and then the wall was breached, into which the Persian army then poured. What the sources don't agree on is how much of the fortifications were breached or otherwise damaged by the sudden surge of water. Theodoret tells us that the walls were breached twice, once when the river entered the city, and once when it punched a section of wall out as it flooded through the streets. Although that source is from the mid-5th century, it's backed up by the account of Ephrem from the late 4th century, who tells us that the walls were breached 3 times. So perhaps it really did happen more than once, but on the other hand, Ephrem may have been invoking the number 3 as Christian symbolism. All the other sources state that this happened once. Mounted troops and elephants then rushed the gap, but they were blocked by defenders who formed a wall of spears, shot arrows at the Persians from the walls, and apparently led an attack from a nearby gate. The ground was waterlogged and muddy, and Roman soldiers and artillery skewered the war elephants or crushed their limbs. And as they fell, they pinned Persians down underneath them, leaving the men to drown in the muck. The Persians were then temporarily repulsed, and the defenders were able to repair at least some of the damaged wall. Although one source does stress that Persians continually shot the breach with arrows to keep Masons away, and thus keep the breach open. Either way, though, this was the point at which the fortunes of the Persians began to seriously decline. 4 of the 5 sources tell us that at this point, the Persians had a vision of the Emperor Constantius walking atop the walls, wreathed in light and wearing a purple robe and backed by the presence of God. But they knew in reality that Constantius was deeper inside Roman territory. So what this demonstrates for the first time in textual sources is the notion of a city's supernatural defender, the Promachos, taking on distinct Christian aspects. There is of course another story that this holy protector was not Constantius, but Saint Jacob, who was active in the first siege but who had since died and was buried in the city, granting it otherworldly protection. The story goes that Jacob summoned insects to pester Shapur's army, and that this spread disease. Whether or not you believe the religious aspects of this account, there probably is some truth to it. With the watery conditions, the bloody fighting, and other factors usually associated with sieges, the siege camp was probably unhygienic and it's likely soldiers would have been becoming ill. The failure to take the breach after so much effort had been spent in making it surely demoralized the army, and disease likely took a toll. Shapur thus ordered the siege equipment destroyed, and apparently executed many of his officers, upon whom he placed the blame for the mission's failure, and the army then retreated. Nisibis, perhaps facing down ships sailing upon arid plains and desert sands, or perhaps not, had withstood the siege, and the city and its people had survived.